So I'm just recording this now. Hi everyone, welcome to Park City Museum's virtual lecture series. We're glad that all of you are here today. And Rick Okabe is a board member of the Topaz Museum, which opened in Delta, Utah in 2017. Although he was not interned, he supports the mission of the Topaz Museum and to preserve the campsite and to tell the story of the Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated there. We are doing this in relation to an exhibit that we have. It's called Righting of Wrong, Japanese Americans and World War II, and it will be on display at the museum until October 4th. Please feel free to come and see the exhibit, and we are very happy to have Rick to tell about the Topaz Museum. So with that, I'm going to say, Andrew, did you want to say a few words too, or are you good?
No, I'm good. I just wanted to thank everybody for attending today. This is a lot of energy and work that we put together for this lecture series, and it's part of a lot of the other activities that we do to piggyback with what's going on as an exhibit, as Diane pointed out. And I just wanted to introduce myself. I am the interim executive director for the museum, and it's my honor to be serving the community as well as its members in this role. And again, I'm highly available and welcome any feedback and input that you have in making our community asset such a better thing for our members and our locals, and of course, all that attend today. So thank you and welcome.
Okay, Rick, if you'd like to start, you may. Thanks again for doing this, and everyone enjoy.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you, Andrew, and the Park City Museum for allowing me to present this PowerPoint presentation about Topaz. I'm not a historian or an educator. I just happen to have family members who were incarcerated in California during the war. And because of the experience of my family members, I've been interested in the Topaz and the internment experience in general, because what it represents in the history of the United States. I was actually worked in Silicon Valley and in business rather than these educational areas. So I appreciate the opportunity to give what I feel is some information about Topaz and why it happened. The incarceration of 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry during World War II was a gross denial of constitutional rights. These people were held in 10 hastily built camps around the country, mostly the western half of the country, for 3.5 years. And there were no trials, there were no attorneys. Not one person was ever convicted or even accused of a crime. They just happened to look like the enemy. Sorry, I'm having a problem with my slide advance. Okay. Excuse me, I've got it. I don't know what happened.
Rick, if you go ahead and find the slide up top on your screen, click on that, and then go ahead and advance it via your arrows. There you go.
There you go.
Okay, I've got it now, I think. Okay, so December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, that was the singular event that started the internment and the incarceration of the Japanese Americans during World War II. Immediately with that event, Japanese communities up and down the West Coast were turned into turmoil and fear because of what might happen. And within 4 months, these folks were started to be removed from their homes. In April of 1942, these posters were started to be posted in these communities along the West Coast. And they had instructions for reporting at a location in their neighborhoods to be taken away to camps. Most of the Topaz attorneys came from the San Francisco Bay Area. At that time, the military had decided that Japanese Americans living along the West Coast posed a national security threat if Japan might want to invade the West Coast. And so they developed a military exclusion zone, which you see in gray on this map, from Seattle, Washington, up in the north, all the way down to Arizona. And it extended about 75 or 100 miles inland. And it declared that nobody of Japanese ancestry could live in this exclusion zone. And so the plan was to build 10 permanent camps around the western part of the United States where people would be taken for the duration of the war. That's the 10 bold names that you see, including Topaz in Utah. The smaller names like Tanforan and Merced and Santa Anita in California were what were called assembly centers, which were racetracks and fairgrounds, which were set up very hastily for the first 6 months while the permanent camps were being built. Here's a blow-up of one of those posters that were put up. It designated the location of where you needed to assemble on a certain date. You could only take what you could carry, a couple of suitcases with clothes, maybe some bedding and some blankets. Any other personal property that you owned, a house, a car, a business, all would have to be disposed of because you were being taken away for the duration of the war. And so because it was known that all these folks had to leave, they were offered essentially 10 cents on the dollar of anything they were trying to sell. And in a matter of weeks, millions of dollars of property was lost. I've highlighted a couple of terms on this poster to tell you about how the government presented what they were doing. The second paragraph says, all Japanese persons, both alien and non-alien. Alien is a term that's used to designate immigrants who are not US citizens. If you're not a citizen and you're an alien, then to be a non-alien obviously must be to be a US citizen who should be protected with their constitutional rights from being taken out of their homes with no trial and no due process. The other term that's I've highlighted here is called evacuated. All Japanese persons, alien and non-alien, will be evacuated. That was a euphemistic term that the government used to describe what was being done to my parents and grandparents at the time. My mother referred to this event as an evacuation, but in her mind, she redefined that word because evacuation is usually used to designate taking people away from an area that's facing a natural disaster like a hurricane or a earthquake. This was not that situation. Here's a shot of buses on the appointed day waiting to take people away. Again, there's only what you could carry, and you didn't know where you were going or when you would be coming back. This internment order covered small children, families, elderly persons, and people who were in hospitals. If you were sick in a hospital, you were taken out, and the camps you were taken to had rude hospitals that were staffed by Japanese Americans. You were required to wear these paper tags with a government issued ID number. So you were turned into a number for processing purposes. And even baby orphans. The government went into orphanages in San Francisco and Los Angeles, took out baby orphans, and set up a special nursery in the Manzanar camp in California that housed about 100 children and babies. Obviously, these were a threat to the United States. One of the founders of our museum board, the Topaz Museum board, was Grace Oster, who during World War II was a 17-year-old high school student. She's pictured standing in the back, second from the left. And this is her mother and grandmother and aunts and uncles and cousins who were all assembled on the Sunday to wait for their processing onto these buses. And as you can see, they're all dressed in their Sunday best. They're trying to present as dignified of a image as they possibly can, even though this is a very fearful time and they weren't quite sure where they were going. For those in the San Francisco Bay Area, their first stop was the Tanforan racetrack in San Bruno, California, which was about 15 miles south of San Francisco. They used, in addition to building some crude barracks, they converted horse stalls into living areas for the internees where they were housed for the first 6 months before Topaz was actually finished. Grace says she remembers the first day walking into this horse stall, and her family was quite upset, and she remembers hearing people crying up and down the row of horse stalls. After the 6 months were finished and Topaz was built, the internees from Tanforan were taken to Oakland and put on trains for a 3-day trip to Delta, Utah, in central Utah. Grace remembers this trip very well. She was told, the soldiers on the train told them and all the other passengers that they needed to pull down the shades when they were passing through the towns on their trip. And she was never sure if that was because the soldiers didn't want her to figure out where they were going, or if they didn't want the residents of the towns they're passing through to see who was in the trains. They arrived at the train station in Delta, Utah. They were loaded on buses, and all the belongings were loaded on trucks, and they were taken 16 miles outside of Delta to the Topaz Camp that had been built in the middle of the severe desert. When they arrived, there was a processing, there was an intake process. They had to fill out forms, they had to take a medical exam, and they were fingerprinted and photographed pretty much like a intake of a prison. They were issued these resident identification cards. This is Grace's card, which they were required to carry while they were in, all the time they were in the camp. The actual campsite was 1 square mile, surrounded by barbed wire. It had guard towers posted along the barbed wire fence, and it was manned with soldiers with searchlights and rifles. This was about over 600 wooden buildings. And in addition to that living area, the government acquired 19,000 acres of land around the campsite because they needed to produce food for the 8,000 or 9,000 residents that were living here. They had a dairy farm to produce milk for the children. They had a hog farm, a turkey farm, and then many acres of produce, which the internees themselves manned. This is a typical barrack block. There were 42 blocks that comprised the entire camp. Each block consisted of 10 20-foot by 120-foot barracks that were designed after regular Army barracks. They did not have any facilities within the housing areas. Each of these barracks buildings were divided into 20-foot by 20-foot rooms, 20 feet by 20 feet for a family of 4 or 5. Because they only had a single light bulb and no other facilities. There were buildings in the center of the block for mess halls, communal showers and toilets, and a recreation hall. So that serviced the 10 barrack buildings that surrounded it. We don't have very many photographs of the interior of the barracks. So here's a sketch that was done by a wife of a camp worker. You can see a family of 5. Now, within the 20 by 20 foot room, there was a single electric light bulb hanging from the ceiling, 5 army cots, and that was pretty much it. And so any furniture was handmade by the internees out of scraps of lumber left over from the building of the camp. You can see the father is sitting on a suitcase and using a barrel as a little table. And that's how you lived in very close quarters. Here's another painting by a local, one of the internees of women and mothers bathing their small babies in the laundry room. I should also mention that this is one of the artists who taught in the Topaz Art School, which was founded by Professor Chiro Obata from Berkeley, who was a professor of art before the war. And when he got to Topaz, realized that there were a lot of people who needed things to do. And so he founded, along with 2 other professional artists, a art school that at one point had 700 artists, students. And so it produced a lot of artwork. It allowed a way for the internees to express themselves and show what they were doing, unfiltered by the government photographers and the government censors. The black and white photographs that I'm showing you were all taken by professional photographers that the government hired to document the experiences going on in the camps. And they were specifically told they could not take pictures of the guard towers, the barbed wire, and again, trying to show that the internees were doing fine. They weren't being mistreated. Because of the nature of the communal eating facilities and the laundry room and the toilets, Grace Oster remembers everywhere you went to do something, you stood in line because everybody was trying to do the same thing. For meals 3 times a day, to go to the bathroom, to go to the laundry room, to go to the co-op store, you stood in line. So that was a memory that was seared in her mind, that you spent a lot of time just waiting around. The other memory that was pretty distinctive in Grace's mind was the fact that you could see the construction of these barracks were very crude. There was no insulation on the walls and no caulking between the boards. And because you were in the desert, the Siberian desert has very fine alkaline dust everywhere. And it would blow into the barracks every day. And one of Grace's jobs was every day was to sweep out that dust that permeated all the rooms. This is a letter that Grace wrote to her father. Now, her father, before the war, had a very successful tofu factory, miso factory in San Francisco. He was a successful businessman. And right after Pearl Harbor, the FBI came and took Grace's father, along with professors, successful businessmen, ministers, any community leaders who the government thought might try to organize the Japanese into resisting their removal. And they took them away. Grace and her mother didn't know where her father was for about 4 or 5 months. He was taken to a military camp in North Dakota. And so once they found out where he was, they started corresponding with him. So this is one of Grace's letters. But what's the thing to note about this letter is up there at the top, you see her handwriting, but you see a white space. There's several places in this letter where there's a white space. And that's because the camp had a censor who read every letter going out of the camp and cut out words and phrases that they thought might be information that they didn't want people to see. They were typically dates and locations. This is again Grace. After the first year, the government still needed men to be fighting over in Europe and the Pacific. And so they opened it up to volunteers from these camps to get young men to volunteer to join the army to fight. And this happens to be a young man who's a brother of a friend of Grace's who came back to the camp to see his parents and his sister behind barbed wire while he's serving in the army. This whole issue caused some conflict within the camps, within the young men in the camps. There were quite a few men who did volunteer. They were willing to go out and fight for their country and die for their country to show and prove their loyalty to the United States, to show and prove that they were willing to do whatever it takes to help defend the country in the war. There was another group of young men who refused to join. They didn't see any reason why they should try to help a country that had put themselves and their families behind barbed wires for no reason at all. And there were fights because each group felt the other one was wrong. There was very strong passions about this conflict. And those conflicts went on for many years after the war was over because it was such a emotional time. The other very tragic thing about this was you had mothers in the camps who ended up grieving for their sons who were lost in the war while they were still behind barbed wire. It's one of the ironies of these camps. It turns out that the men who volunteered were put in segregated all-Japanese units, and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which fought in Europe, was one of the most highly decorated units of the war of its size. And in 1945, the war ended. There was no longer a reason for the Japanese Americans to be confined and incarcerated in these camps. So they were given a train ticket, one-way train ticket to anywhere they wanted to go. and $50, and were sent on their way. Most of the Topaz internees went back to the San Francisco Bay Area. A few stayed here in Utah, including Grace Oster and her family. Her father was reunited with them, and they actually opened up the Fujimoto miso factory in Salt Lake. And for a number of years, it was very successfully shipped miso and tofu across the country. But when the Japanese Americans got back to their homes, they were met with a lot of resistance and discrimination. People felt that if the government locks you up in a prison camp for 3.5 years, you must have done something wrong. And so there was a lot of resistance to have them come back, including protests all up and down the West Coast. And it caused the Japanese Americans to sort of cluster in neighborhoods, in Japantowns, and to protect themselves. And it took them a while, but they slowly were able to rebuild their lives, rebuild their families. And in general, like my parents, for example, they moved to Chicago. They worked their way across to Chicago, where they reestablished themselves. That's why I was born and raised in Chicago. And they put myself and my 2 sisters through college, and had a pretty good life. But to start from scratch in their mid-20s took a lot of determination and grit, but they felt that's how they had to do it. This is Topaz today. If you go out to the site, Delta is about 2.5 hours south of here. And it's pretty barren. One of the things is this is the actual location of the Topaz Camp. When the camp was first constructed, the government planted about 1,000 trees, and most of those trees died within the first year. This is what's left. It's the fine alkaline dust is there. A lot of the sagewood is there, but not much else. However, if you go to Google Maps and Google Topaz, this is what you see. This is a satellite picture from Google Maps. It clearly shows the 1 square mile of camp. It shows the 42 barrack blocks. There's a 4-block area that's white in the center. That was an open field area, which was the location of the high school and had football and baseball fields. And then the strip across the top represents the outlines of the camp hospital, the military housing, and warehousing for the supplies for the camp. So as a result of this, the Topaz Museum was started by a woman named Jane Beckwith in the early 80s. She was born and raised in Delta. She was a high school teacher for Delta High. And she's the one that founded the Topaz Museum board in the 90s. And all her life has been working to preserve this campsite, because it's a historic campsite, and build a museum, which I'll talk about in a little bit more. That campsite in 2007 was designated a National Historic Landmark because of its importance in the history of the United States and in Utah. And it's one of 13 National Historic Landmarks in Utah. If you go out to the site, there is still parts of the original barbed wire fence that exists. It's not very tall. It's about 5.5 feet tall. It's not very formidable looking. But if you think about it, it's the middle of the desert. It's 17 miles from the town of Delta, which is 3,500 people. So even if you got under the fence and tried to run away, there's not a whole lot of places to go. And sooner or later, you would be spotted and recognized as being somebody that probably should be in the camp. The other photograph shows the footings of one of the guard towers that still exist. If you walk around the campgrounds, you can see lines of rocks that the internees use to demark their barrack entrances. You can see pieces of pottery, pieces of toys, all sorts of bits and pieces that show that Topaz once existed. And during World War II, it was the 5th largest city in the state of Utah. After the war, in the early 70s and early 80s, it was decided that Congress appropriated money to hold congressional hearings across the country and to take testimony of former internees to try to look into what happened, how it happened, and examine the process or the lack of constitutional process that was denied the internees their rights. And so they took testimony. It took about a year. They produced a final report, and basically they concluded that no documented evidence of espionage or sabotage. The Japanese were not dangerous to the country. There was no direct military necessity for this incarceration. And the actions of the government were caused by race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. So it was the first time the government had admitted what was done during World War II was wrong. And it was fairly significant because as part of the conclusions of the commission study, it designated that the government would apologize to every living former internee. And so in 1980, the first President Bush mailed this letter of apology to every surviving internee. To me, this is pretty significant. The government doesn't apologize for its mistakes very often. And this, along with a token redress payment of $20,000, was sent to every former internee, including my parents. So to recap, 120,000 innocent people were incarcerated behind barbed wire for 3.5 years. There were no attorneys, no trials, no crimes were committed. It happened to a group of people who, of 120,000 people, 66% were US-born American citizens like my parents. They were born in the United States and they were US citizens by birth. The other 27% were first-generation immigrants. And they were all lumped together as being enemies of the United States. This didn't happen overnight. This didn't happen just because of Pearl Harbor. The first generation immigrants from Japan started in the late 1800s. And they were treated just like every other first generation immigrant group coming to the United States, whether they be from Europe or the Far East or South America. They were initially only offered very lowest level jobs working in the fields, working in the coal mines. In Utah, I was working in the coal mines, working on the railroads. And on the West Coast, they were treated very poorly. There had been prejudice against them for over 70 years prior to World War II. For example, in 1870, there was a Nationalization Act that allowed immigrants from Africa to become naturalized citizens. But immigrants from Japan were specifically classified as aliens and not allowed to become US citizens. Now this term aliens I mentioned it earlier in the poster, and it's a term that's used for immigrants coming from another country who are not US citizens. And the term aliens is also used, to describe beings from outer space. And it's almost like saying these first generation immigrants were so foreign, so exotic, so different that they could never become real Americans. And this act prevented that from happening. In California, I told you that the first generation immigrants from Japan were typically hired to work in the fields in Central California. They did that very well. They worked very hard. They developed, because they had farmed in Japan where the land is very unproductive because it's very rocky. There's not a lot of farmland like we have in the United States. They developed labor-intensive methods to get more produce out of their farming. They slowly became successful as they started to save money and try to buy up start farmers of their own. The existing California farmers looked at that as an economic threat, and so they started lobbying for laws like this one, which is called the Alien Land Law, to prevent any first-generation Japanese from owning land. In 1927, a bill was passed which prevented any Japanese from immigrating to the United States. Also included Chinese. And so from 1927 to 1952, there was no immigration. It was stopped completely. And if you want, you could call this a wall that was built across the Pacific Ocean to stop the undesirables from entering. By the way, it didn't cost $1 billion. After Pearl Harbor, as I mentioned with Grace's father, the FBI arrested businessmen, community leaders, who they thought would try to organize the Japanese in the neighborhoods from going to the camps. The FBI just rounded them all up. They were obviously working with lists of community leaders, and it had been tracking these leaders and had them on a register, just like we've heard recently with the Muslims. So these are things that were being done that are still being done today and are used as a means to try to prevent immigrants from just fulfilling the all-American dream of working hard, making a little money to support your family, and having a good life in the United States. And it continues to today, or rather recently anyway, in 2017, as the talk of a Muslim registry was coming up in the administration. The Japanese American internment was used to justify the Muslim registry, which has been proposed. Also, just recently, there was a protest outside of Fort Sill in Oklahoma. Former Japanese internees protested at Fort Sill, which was being proposed as a camp to hold migrant children. And it happened to also hold some Japanese Americans during World War II. And so former internees who are still alive have banded together to form a protest group, and they are actively trying to bring attention to the migrant children camps that are being still sustained on the southern border. That's pretty much my talk. I'd like to just quickly give a plug to the Topaz Museum. This museum was conceived of by our president and founder 20 years ago. She, for that length of time, she always wanted to have a museum. She thought it was important to do that in Delta. We opened in the summer of 2017, 3 years ago, and we have exhibits, we have artifacts. We try to tell the story of the internment and of Topaz with more details than what I've been able to give you today. But we're very proud of it. We've got a lot of support from Utahns and businesses in Utah and the state of Utah. It took us about 12 years to go from an idea to trying to figure out how we do this, because we're a all volunteer board, and had no experience in museum design or raising this kind of money. But we're very proud of it, and we invite you to come and visit, although right now we're shut down because of the virus. We do have a website. If you Google Topaz Museum, you can check out our website, and they'll let you know when we're opening again. We haven't got plans at this point because of the virus, but we've been very successful. We have busloads of school children come down every year. Again, that may be tempered this coming fall, but we'll see what happens. But we are very proud of it. And again, a lot of artifacts, a lot of former internees from the Bay Area come to see the site and see our museum, and they figure out that they've had something stored in their garage or their attic, and they donate to the museum. We also have a restored half of a barrack building behind the building. After the war, all the buildings were sold off. Some farmers in the area bought them for storage sheds, and this was actually a former storage shed. And when Jane Beckwith heard that this farmer was going to tear it down, she convinced him to donate it to the museum, and we had it restored. So that's my talk. I hope this has been informational for you. This is a topic that's not mandated in any school district curriculum, so it's up to individual teachers to produce their own materials to teach their students. We do have online teacher workshops that are sponsored by the Topaz Museum, and I give this talk to anybody who will listen to me, because I think it's important, because again, a lot of people in the country still don't quite understand what happened during World War II and why this is such an important historical event. Thank you.
Rick, thank you very much. I appreciate it. We have a couple of questions though. Sarah wants to know, did any groups help Japanese Americans after they were released in an organized way?
Yes, there were some Quaker groups on the East Coast I'm aware of. I don't know about helping them after the war, but the ACLU, and particularly in San Francisco, did help trying to present some of the lawsuits that were filed, calling the internment unconstitutional. Those lawsuits have never been they've been overturned for technical reasons because the government hid some evidence, but they have never been ruled, the internment of the Japanese Americans has never been formally ruled in a court of law as being, or by the Supreme Court as being unconstitutional. And so there's still some people who are trying to figure out if that can still be done.
Okay. Dorian has a question too. Dorian, did you want to ask, or do you want me to ask?
No, I'll ask. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Yes.
I can hear you.
Rick, during the Roosevelt administration, were there any major actions to challenge this from any of the judicial branches?
No, well, like I said, there were individuals, there were several individuals who filed lawsuits. There was, the most famous is, and now I'm blanking on the name. Korematsu, Fred Korematsu. He was a welder in Oakland, California. He said, I'm not going to these camps. So he hid for a while, thinking he could avoid being caught. I don't know exactly how it happened, but he was caught. And he was actually ended up in Topaz. But he with the help of the ACLU, filed a lawsuit that said this was an unconstitutional act. There were 4 significant lawsuits like that. They went all the way up to the Supreme Court, but then they were not overturned. The Supreme Court did not overturn those lawsuits, and they stayed on the books until the 80s, and there was a pro bono group of young Japanese American attorneys and a couple of Caucasian attorneys who discovered that reports from the FBI and the Army intelligence had been written that said, we found no acts of sabotage or no suspicious people within this group of Japanese Americans, and felt they were not at risk. Those reports were suppressed and were not introduced in court. And so what happened was the convictions were overturned, but they were never brought up and concluded as being unconstitutional. So in that sense, they were overturned, and the people felt vindicated. The plaintiffs felt vindicated, but it's, like I said, it's still not officially unconstitutional.
Were there any congressional inquiries or along that nature?
The one congressional inquiry that I mentioned, I talked about before, that led to the apology.
I mean, during the Roosevelt administration.
No, not that I know of.
Okay, does anyone else have questions? I'm just making sure that there's no other questions coming up.
Okay.
I think we're good. Well, Rick, thank you again for all your information and for sharing and for being with us tonight. And it was a great lecture, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for joining us tonight. I really do appreciate it. And Rick, you're getting a lot of thank yous, just so you know. I don't know if you're seeing the chats, but people are thanking you, so.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. One new message. All right. I'm gonna end this. Rick, thank you again, and I will talk to you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.